Hello, welcome to the Technical Gentleman. So this is the first in a series of basic educational videos that I'm going to be putting out. They're going to be short and hopefully very accessible. I'm not going to get too technical with any of this stuff, but they are important. The best way to fight against the big tech companies and the government surveillance and censorship and all that stuff, ultimately it's to arm yourself with knowledge. So it's very important that you do your due diligence and attempt to learn some of these really basic things, just so that you know what you're have some idea of what we're doing here going forward once we start getting into some of the actual tutorials. So if you see a title of a video and you already kind of know what's going on, feel free to skip over it. But if it's a concept you haven't heard of it about before, or you're not as comfortable with, please do actually watch that video and arm yourself with that knowledge. It is very important. So the topic for today's video is going to be open source software versus proprietary or closed source software. And we're going to talk about what all that means and why it is you want to be trying to use open source software as much as possible. So we all have some idea or some understanding that the programs that we use, the applications we use, are made up of code. And what is code? Well, it's what's floating up here behind me. Not really, but it looks pretty. But it's nothing more than sets of instructions that programmers like me put into the computer to tell the computer to do the things that we want it to do. So if we want to build a program, you have to actually write the code that's going to tell the computer to do what we want the program to do. When somebody like me, or somebody who's a lot smarter than me, writes a piece of code to create a program, and they go to publish that program, they have a choice as to whether or not they want to publicly release the code that comprises that program. So if I release a new web browser that I've made, I can either release that program and share all of the code that I have written that comprises that program, so that the public, anybody, me, you, anybody can actually look it up and see that code. And that is what we call an open source program. Alternatively, they can not release the code. They can release the program, but not actually release the code. They keep the code private as their own kind of intellectual property. And me, you, nobody's able to actually see the code that comprises that program. And that kind of program we call proprietary or closed sourced. So why is this important? The main reason that this is important is for accountability and transparency. You need to be able to know, if you care about your privacy, if you care about your security, you need to know what the programs on your computer are doing. So I think probably the clearest example of this would be a web browser. If you are using a certain web browser, say you're using Chromium or Microsoft Edge or Safari or Firefox, if you're worried about your privacy and security, one of the things that might come to mind as being a potential threat is the web browser itself. Is the web browser monitoring the sites that you're visiting and sending that information off to the developer of that particular web browser? So is Safari sending your search history to Apple? Is Microsoft Edge is that sending your search history to Microsoft? Google Chrome sending it to Google? Is Firefox sending it to Mozilla? That's obviously a big concern. Web browsers obviously have the capability of seeing everything that you're doing, given the fact that you're using them as the gateway into the internet. So you want to be able to verify that the web browser that you're using isn't sending data to whatever company made that web browser, or wherever else the company may want to send that information. If a piece of software is proprietary, even if it had settings inside of the web browser to disable things like telemetry, where they're collecting information on your web browser usage, which most web browsers have some form of telemetry built into them, where they're web browsers are very open. Developers' web browsers are very open that, hey, we are collecting this information. A lot of them do have options inside of the settings to maybe disable or limit what information is being sent. And so let's say you had a button inside that web browser to toggle, do you want to send information to the developer of this web browser, yes or no? If that web browser is proprietary, you have no way of verifying what that button is actually doing. You could disable the telemetry and the data collection in that web browser through their settings, or think that you are, and you have no way of verifying that when you switch that setting off, it's actually stopped sending that information, because you can't see what the code is doing in the background. Likewise, they may have the web browser may provide no information as to what data they are or aren't collecting. If it's a proprietary piece of software, you have no way of knowing what information is being collected, where that information is being sent. There's just no way to verify that. If a piece of software is open source, what that means is that you have people out there like me and millions of other people out there like me who are constantly scanning these pieces of software for potential breaches where they could be sharing that information. So Mozilla Firefox is an open source web browser, at least for the most part. They have a button inside of that web browser to disable their telemetry services. So we're not going to send any of the information we're collecting from this web browser to Mozilla, who develops us. It's all just going to stay local on your device. So it's private. At least it's private. At least the web browser itself is not sharing that information, I should say. I can go through and look at the actual code that comprises Firefox and verify that when I disable telemetry in that web browser, I'm actually disabling telemetry. I know with 100% certainty, because I can see the code, that Mozilla is not collecting my information when I disable that feature. I have no way of knowing that if I'm using Chrome or Microsoft Edge or Safari, because those are all pieces of proprietary software. This principle holds true for any piece of software that's on your computer, ranging from maybe if you have an email client, if you've got obviously web browser we've already talked about, even the operating system itself. If you're using Windows or Mac OS, you're using a proprietary operating system. You can't see the code that comprises that operating system. I can't see the code that comprises that operating system. You and I have no idea what that operating system is doing in the background. We don't have any control over it. Making that kind of operating system, ensuring that kind of operating system is private, is basically impossible. So it is very, very important that as we're moving forward, as we're talking about how to secure your digital life, make yourself more private, make yourself more secure, we need to start migrating away from these proprietary pieces of software, which is probably the bulk of what you're using right now. Most people are using mostly proprietary software. So as we're moving along in these videos, we're going to be gradually moving you away from the proprietary software that you're used to using to open source alternatives. You'll still be able to have a web browser, you'll still be able to have, all of the stuff. It's just going to be open source alternatives that we know are secure, we know are private. Think of it like the ultimate auditing system. Millions of eyes on that program, on that code, constantly auditing it to make sure that it is secure and to make sure that it is private. You cannot get that with proprietary software. So you may not be aware, but if your software is open source or proprietary, we're going to get into the specifics of what software is or isn't. And if you're really curious, you could do a quick search online and find out. But this is going to be a really, really important concept. And it's one that's not talked about nearly enough when people are discussing digital privacy and security. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want more of this, please subscribe to the channel, go visit my website, and we'll be coming out with more of these educational videos and then moving on, of course, to some tutorials to help you out here with securing your digital life. So thanks for joining us, and guys, have a nice day.